Good morning, everyone. I'd like to go ahead and call to order our subcommittee meeting today. I want to welcome all the subcommittee members and welcome all viewing remotely. Before we begin, some housekeeping. I have a few notes sorry about that. I have a few notes about conducting the virtual meeting, and I need to do myself, turn off all items that might be a disturbance to our meeting today. The meeting must comply with all the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. Accordingly, the public may view the meeting via a link provided in the advertised agenda. Unlike in-person meetings where all visitors are visible, it is important to remember that members of the public may be viewing through the KBE Media portal and to be mindful of this throughout the discussion today. Please ensure your video is streaming and that you can be seen throughout the duration of the meeting. For any items that require a vote, a roll call vote will be necessary to record the vote of each member. At that time, the member should state his or her name, pause, and then state, I vote yes or I vote no. Please silence and turn off all other electronic devices that may cause a disruption to your sound feed, as mine just did. So we'll go ahead with the roll call, Meredith.
Randy Poe.
I am present.
Lou Young.
Lou Young, present.
Nicola Mason.
Nicola Mason, present.
Audrey Gilbert.
Present.
Penny Christian.
Penny Christian, present.
Okay, Chair, you do not yet have a quorum, but we do know that additional members are planning to join shortly, so you can proceed with discussion. We just cannot take any action until we do have a quorum today.
Okay, thank you. Potential revision to the proposed portrait of a learner. We're going to have a discussion, and Donnie's going to lead that particular discussion. So, and we had a possible addition that we're going to look at and imagine and play with new possibilities with curiosity and create approaches that are novel, useful, and valued by the world around them. So, Donnie, you want to lead us in that discussion?
Sure, happy to do so. And for the viewing audience out there, I just wanted to highlight that I'm using my Kentucky mug, which says good states, Kentucky, you know, bad states everywhere else. So still applying for my dual citizenship.
Play into the crowd, Tran.
That's right. That's right. You know. So I really appreciate Chair Young sharing back the Essential Skills and Dispositions document that was written by my colleague
Sarah
Lynch, and I drew from that and made just one change in order to kind of merge some of the thinking that occurred our last and we added creative an individual's ability to personally interpret experiences, imagine and play with new possibilities with curiosity, and create approaches that are novel, useful, and valued by the world around them. So the only thing that maybe we want to work on here, just symmetry-wise, so you might notice that the word curiosity is in there. That's not actually in the original definition from the document, from the Essential Skills and Dispositions framework, but thought that it goes in that particular space where we have that. The only issue is that it is not symmetrical to the other. Oops. Sorry, let me put it in here. That was not going. Okay, well, but that it is here. I'm sorry, I'm copying and pasting in here. Okay.
And welcome, Mike. And there is a link to the document that Donnie's talking about over in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry, I was at the Shelby County Schools Work-Based Learning Steering Committee, and it was a lot of folks, very exciting, and I couldn't get out. Sorry for the late.
Oh, no rest weary, Mike. But thank you for everything that you continue to do on all these fronts. Because all of the other ones start with verbs, so they all start with engages, demonstrates, shows. So I imagine we could actually
Start with personally interprets or interprets, yeah.
Mm-hmm. interprets experiences, imagines and plays with new possibilities, and creates approaches that are novel, useful, and valued by the world around them.
And I really like how Sarah and the team at Lexion, or whatever they are called now, thought about this in terms of developmental appropriateness, because even Randy said plays with as we got started, and I love that. And I also think it is broad enough, but it allows for Dr. Todd's conversation around innovation and entrepreneurship to be part of that creative contributor to the larger society. I think it even, to me, speaks a little bit to justice. So I think it's strong and I like it. And I appreciate you actually pulling that together as a statement, Donnie.
Sure, and thank you to Meredith for helping be a thought partner on this. This is a good team effort.
So just for clarification, this would be a sixth. This is 6 point now. Okay, we weren't combining anything. Okay.
And I know that folks asked about this. I've reviewed notes.
Donnie, do we have where we have all the 6 listed out so that we could see what the 6 are as a unit now?
Yep. So if you go to the
shows on the screen.
Yeah, for the viewing audience, Meredith, it would probably be good to put
because
that
I can't.
up.
Yeah.
Let me try. I can actually do that. I apologize. Let me.
Because we got to see how they match up as a whole.
Yeah, is my screen showing up?
Yeah, just make that section bigger, Donnie, please.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be a stickler, but I just wonder if there's been a conversation about the order of these. As a music teacher, I'm always kind of seeing creativity at the end, right? In Bloom's taxonomy, I'd like it to be the first thing instead of the last thing. I don't know if there's been a conversation about that. Perhaps they're of equal importance and it doesn't matter, but I wonder about the perception of having creativity as the last indicator.
Chair Poe, I really appreciate Nicola's comment there. Before we added this one, remember there was a work group that had landed on the other 5, and that's why we kept them so intact. And at the time, one of the things I really liked about it is that in the center of the 5 was empowered learner, so that the academic competencies, the mindsets related to academic rigor and content and the knowledge acquisition was kind of in the center. Now we've thrown that off because we don't have an odd number. Of course, we have 6. I also would put in, there's some symmetry for me in ending in engaged citizen, since that, in my mind, is our ultimate goal as public educators in the U.S., is that we would, in fact, educate the citizenry to be contributing members of society. So I don't know if people have the patience or the will to think about reordering these. I don't think it's an order of importance as much as it is an order that that speaks to the way the user would perceive the work. So in other words, I don't know that I think any of the others are more valuable. I think Nicola's comment that they are of equal importance is probably important to capture as well. Oh, sorry, grand dog.
Yeah. So basically, you know, what we've got on the discussion is, I mean, is everybody, before we get into ordering, we need to make sure that everybody likes the creative contributor to be added to the list, and then we can rework the list. But first, I think we need to make sure that we're all in agreement for creative collaborator. That's where the discussion is, I think, first. Is there any other questions or concerns in relationship to, you know, what KDE staff and consultants are giving us at this particular time? I'm sorry, Donnie, on my thing, it's because I need better reading glasses that I can see, but I still can't. I have a tough time being able to read that's on that screen. And maybe it's on my end, but.
The link is over in the chat, Randy.
Yeah, I'm just saying for the people
Oh.
that's viewing that, I mean, I'm having a tough time, but I have it on a separate screen, but I'm just saying on that screen for others to see if they don't have it. There we go.
I see that David is on the call. I really appreciated that comment about the fact that it will probably show up in a nonlinear. This is not going to be just a bulleted graphic. So I think that's important. And if there's a way in the graphic that we show the interrelatedness of them, that would be powerful. But David, I wonder if I might push your recollection. The original 10 districts that worked on the anchor competencies, did they have conversation around creativity, curiosity, and innovation, and it just didn't make the list? Or did they hone in on these 5 and, knowing that they were at a starting place? Might you recall?
Yeah. Thanks, Lou. Initially, the first one had a line through it that said critical thinker, innovator, and a lot of discussion was had, and they felt like, I think, that inside a critical thinker is someone who has to be curious and creative, but they didn't raise it up to a level of a separate or some other. They looked at that, and if you're thinking deeply as a critical thinker, then you're going to have to figure out new solutions and new. It's part of being a critical thinker. The other one that was in there, early discussions, and it's similar to critical thinker, is a problem solver. That's something that Aaron brought up at the state board meeting.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to think of this on the level that this gets down to, the classroom and so forth, and it's just not a pretty picture on a particular wall. And I understand, we want to develop entrepreneurs and we want to do the different things, but for that, I see elementary teachers saying on this particular, issues. How are we? I mean, it's got to be part of a particular lesson as opposed to almost to me, a separate competency. But I'm just thinking that if I'm sitting in a 5th grade classroom or a 4th grade classroom of students that I was talking to yesterday at Ignite on the different things, how, and that's David, help me out here. How am I doing this particular competency in that 4th grade classroom? Give me.
Yeah, and I think that's I don't know exactly, Randy, what the example is, but I think it's important for you all to think about, for all of them, asking yourselves the questions which we did back then. And if you look now at our performance outcomes that we created, to your point about elementary kids, is we asked ourselves the questions for each one of these. What does this look like?
Right.
And that we came up with indicators of what you might see a 2nd grader doing to be an effective communicator. And so so the exercise I think it would be beneficial is to say, what are those indicators for a 2nd grader for a creative contributor? And if you can easily come up with those, then you probably do have a good basis for having this separated out as another competency. So just a suggestion about the group might want to, you can look back at those performance outcomes for the other 5 and see what we said about 2nd graders, 5th graders, 8th graders, and 12th graders, and what it would look like for a learner at that level.
Yeah, I love that.
Me too.
Chair Poe, if I may, I love this one, especially when I think about elementary. And I just put in the note, and again, I've read the whole 4th section of essential skills and dispositions around creativity. So I've seen how the team has unpacked that in a developmental way. So I have an edge to that as well. But so a lot of times when we talk about thinking in our training as teachers, we learned about convergent thinking and divergent thinking. And so, and we didn't spend enough time, in my opinion, on the divergence side of things. And that for me is a real equity conversation about kids who approach problems in divergent, unique ways. But teachers know that when they see it. And then of course there's the writing element that coalesces so wonderfully with effective communicator in terms of, you know, really thinking and performing and creating. And then imaginative play at primary, I think, is so valued in their work that they you know, begin to, we have, you know, assessments at primary on play-based learning. And so there, to me, there are a lot of touch points. But I also don't want to be in a position where I'm like the champion of this overselling, overkilling in the process. To me, it does add that level that Holly talked about in the very beginning about the arts, about divergent thinking. Even leadership is often a divergent construct. So I think it does bring some richness to the work, but I also know that we are kind of upsetting the prior anchor competencies apple cart work as we do this.
And I don't think, Lou, just one other point. I don't think that's bad that you're having these conversations. The other piece of that exercise I might suggest is, and I have a personal story, but I'm not going to tell it today because you don't have time, about a district that inappropriately figured out a way to assess creativity. And I worry about that tremendously.
Yes.
A student a friend of mine's child was determined to not be creative because their creativity didn't match the rubric that was used for, they were creative in a different way. They were differently smart.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I mean, that could be said of most of these, but that one really, I worry a little bit about measuring creativity. Or do you want to simply have the indicators be something that just says the student demonstrated creativity, not how they demonstrated creativity, but because I worry that could easily be co-opted to be something that we want kids to be creative in this way.
I'm noticing that Penny's hand is up.
Oh, sorry. Okay, Penny, we're having a discussion, so you just join in when.
Thank you.
Sorry. So good morning, everyone. And this is I'm glad David brought that up and Lou mentioned it because this is just where I'm going. I'm concerned about how you measure this. I'm concerned about and actually the person I interviewed for my homework said that she felt that creativity places limits. And she says it places limits because of just this issue. How arbitrary and subjective is creativity? At the elementary level, creativity is, gosh, all of those questions and all. Yes, all those questions in middle school and high school. It's like, oh my God, they won't shut up, right? So my concern, I don't know about this as an indicator. I get why, but I also, as the parent of an arts person, several arts, 4 arts people, this doesn't feel artsy to me. And when I say artsy, I mean it doesn't feel like they're addressing that different type of learning, because people who are strong in the arts tend to think differently, right? So they want that. I prefer innovation to creativity. I'm just wondering about how this is going to be measured and how arbitrary it's going to be to measure.
I will say, as someone who's given 2 defenses over the last 2 years with creativity as one of my skills, it has changed how I look at creativity as a concept. It was at first very challenging for me to realize what creativity looks like for me. I'm not somebody who's super artistic. So I had to look at what creativity means on a broader scale, because typically it had been defined at my school as somebody who can draw, somebody who can paint, somebody who can play music. And I'm not one of those people. I will say, though, watching my peers go through the process of developing their skill defense over the last year, I realized how important creativity is, because it's given everyone the chance to recognize that they are creative. people who have been told in the past that they're not creative have been able to say, well, look at this project that I did for my social studies class. This shows how I'm creative. I think it goes back to that number 4 on the implementation process, having students give a voice to what they've experienced in the education system. Creativity, I think, is important on that level. And the person that I interviewed talked about how creativity is important. And I know he's a technologically savvy student. And he talked about how creativity and curiosity really give him that chance to show what it looks like in a different realm, something that's not necessarily artistic, but what creative problem solving looks like for him.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's, well, if I were sort of interpreting the conversation a little bit, there seems to be sort of values alignment around the idea of creativity. The majority of the concern seems to be like, well, what happens? What are the negative consequences or unintended consequences of measuring it in certain ways that then create disincentives or bad, unintended outcomes based on trying to measure it some certain way. I would say that we can badly measure all of these. And so I wonder if maybe that's orientation that we just need to make sure that we think about an implementation, but if we value creativity, then I think that there's value to keeping it in.
Yeah, and I understand, and looking at both sides of this, and it seems like to me that at the same point in time, I guess I was looking maybe for this to be intermingled with the other things and brought into that particular conversation. This seems more that just as, was just said here, I can see this on capstone projects. I can see this on dissertations, and I can see this. I start, from Donnie's exercise yesterday and talking to teachers, talking to students, and because I did all three: students, teachers, and superintendent, or principals, students, and teachers. And the concern is that, all of a sudden we're going to be throwing all these different things at them, and most of them are incorrect in their thing, but they're going to look at these things and say, okay, in my lessons, how do I effectively add all 6 of these? And that's not what they're supposed to do, but that's what that's where it comes down to. So now all of a sudden I'm going to be judged on this is a profile of a learner versus a profile of a graduate. We switched over to. So at all levels, we're asking all teachers, and I guess David and them will define these things, but now I'm gonna have to make sure that whichever grade level I'm on, I'm teaching these 6 things, because that's what I want leaving at my grade level, every child on this thing. So I'm looking at primary being able to, they got 26 things that they have to check off now, and these 6 things are going to be developed in there. So I just see us adding a lot onto teacher plates, and that's my only concern with going with 6 versus having 5 very, very substantive things and having creative contributor in that. But that's just my opinion for the discussion itself, but not trying to lead that discussion in any particular way, but just my thoughts of at the end of that, where 6 becomes almost one too many for me. I don't have any problem with creative contributor. I just have a problem with going to 6 from the first 5 that we had and all the different things that were developed around that,
And I remember, Randy, you guys had 10 in Boone County,
Yeah.
and we realized that it was just unwieldy. And so there is something about the girth of the profile, I think, that has to be taken into consideration. But I appreciate that you started by pointing out the fallacy of the thinking that this is not adding 6 standards to every content area approach. The implementation is wildly different from what you described. Now, is it fair to say a lot of folks will, enter into the conversation thinking that is how this works? 100%. Yes, you're right. You touched on what I think would be one of those myths that we would have to bust from the very beginning of the conversation. One of the things that I think is really important when you look at well-developed profiles, as ours is becoming, is that there is so much connection across and among the skills and competencies here, skills, dispositions, and competencies here that we. One of the professional learning angles is going to be, how do we really grapple with what implementation looks like, knowing that empowered learner is where we have spent the vast majority of our instructional and assessment time in P12 since No Child Left Behind. So how do we expand our thinking, lift up our eyes, but look at this in such a way that the gestalt of all of the profile is tackled in a very different way, not a linear, hierarchical, add these on top of kind of approach. Easier said than done, though, I understand.
Yeah, and that's why you're chairman of the board. of that explanation, because that's, and I'm down here trying to look at this from the classroom level versus that higher level thinking that you have, just like their empowered learner to me is where this is all about, because that's where the freedom to teach and the freedom to learn comes in for our teachers and our students. And to me, that's also where that imagine and play and new possibilities and curiosity all comes in with that empowered learner. But now, we got empowered learner separate and creative contributor will be separate. And I kind of see them. I see an empowered learning going back to, Willis or whatever his name is, on freedom to learn. And that's what and Young Zhao about an empowered learner. What that truly means is somebody who really sees the material, dives deep into it, but can also see the material in a different way and interpret that material in a different way. As Young Zhao talks about in world-class education, is that we give them the deeper learning so that they can be curious, so they can come out with their passion. And that's what an empowered learner is to me. But, it can be separate, but I just see it as, that's the reason why I like 5 instead of 6. But other discussions, got your hand up. These windows are so small, so I can't see. I'm sorry, I'm not a great team person. So Mason, you have your hand up, just join in the conversation.
Sure, absolutely. It was a great conversation. Anyone who uses the word gestalt in any sentence has my respect. Thank you. I just, in talking with people, I think creativity is one of the easiest to implement. I mean, we've all done some interviews. I did 3 interviews over the last few days, and that conversation about the creativity component, uniform across the board, they said it's critical. And, I think if you ask anybody, they're going to say creativity is important, but it's like, put your money where your mouth is. I mean, are we going to put this down on paper and make it real? Because this is where our values are. If you ask any employer, if I look at the 6, they're probably going to say creativity is right up there at the top. They want employers who can think creatively, think outside the box, come up with new novel ideas. So I think excluding it from the 5 would be a grave error. If I think about implementation in the classroom, there are various ways you can approach creativity. I mean, it's teaching for creativity, but it's also creative teaching. There are different components and levels that we can present it to teachers, and we can encourage the right application. I'm not a big proponent or supporter of assessing it in the traditional way as we think about assessment, but I think implementation, and if you think about the portrait of a teacher, then implementation might be a way that we could focus on assessment. But I hear you, Randy. 5 feels comfortable, right? Because it has a center. 6 maybe not so much, but it has a golden mean if it's 6.
I know. I'm just, from experience, I can get you up to 11 that everybody valued, but then after we put 11 on there, it's like, they had a whole year of bringing it down to combining 11 into 5, and that's right. David, I mean, is there any around these portraits that you've seen, because you've done all this particular work? I mean, from states, is it 5, 6, 7, 3, or is there any magical approach to this?
So David popped off for a CGSA meeting.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Well, Lou, you've done lots of work in this particular area.
Sure.
So.
I looked at the Education Commission of the States statewide brief that Donnie sent us before the last meeting, and my team and I had done several sessions around statewide portraits, and we actually presented to the state board, or they did, my team did. And so yeah, the magic numbers tend to be 5 or 6. I don't know of any with fewer than 5, but there are certainly some with more than 6. So there is an arbitrariness to the actual number. But I think the impression is important in that. Let me go back to that ECS document and see if I can do a quick scan. But generally speaking, even at the school and district level, 5 or 6 almost always falls out as the number.
We have.
Oh, sorry, you're still muted, Audrey.
We have 6 at our district level, and we've had those for about 4 or 5 years now, and they've seemed to have gone fairly well, with creativity being one of them.
Okay.
I know Jefferson has 5 plus 1 signature skill. Marshall has 6. Boone had 10. Bridge performance indicators in Fleming, I think, is at 6. I'll double check that one.
I mean, the research on human working memory suggests that 6 is the limit of like things that you can hold in your mind at any given time.
Okay. Well, I mean, anybody else have any particular discussion that Travis joining us, as you'll see on your screen, there's a 6th competency that was added, creative contributor. We've had discussions up to this point in time about keeping it at 5 and intermixing that or keeping that separate. I would say the majority of the conversation has been around keeping it separate. But before we are going to proceed to a vote on this issue, I'll let you get a chance to weigh in, looking at that and what your thoughts are on keeping that as a separate or on intermixing that with empowered learner or one of the other 4 or 5.
Yeah, I guess I'm of the opinion I think it should have been incorporated into the others. That would be my preference. However, I think as you roll this out from a statewide perspective, school districts are still have the opportunity to do it how they want to position it. So I certainly understand and respect the group's decision on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that basically kind of sums up where we are. So I think we need to have a motion and a vote on adding this 6th competency. So I would take a recommendation for that.
One last question.
Go ahead.
David's point of going through the effort to come up with metric for this, I thought was a good one. I think that would be worth the time and effort to do that. It might be as simple as Nick thought, but and then that would only make it more clear that it's the right thing to do. But the others do have metrics largely defined, and this one, if it can be easily defined for the teachers at the various levels, then it's a no-brainer. And if we struggle with it, then it might clarify that maybe it does belong in the other 5. I think that's got some strength to it.
Do not disagree. We're tasked with, if we're going to send it to the full board, we've got to make that decision because that's what we are tasked to do if we're going to send this to the full board. And then that really, and Lou, correct me if I'm wrong, that sets it into action then for KDE to develop the action items underneath of this. They don't have a choice not to figure it out at that time. They have to then promulgate something to it.
I think that's a fair understanding. And Mike, it's also a really good question. So it's chicken and egg. So typically, and this is not obligatory, but typically organizations develop the portrait first and then the hard work really begins, where the learning progressions are developed from there, as happened with the anchor competencies, the first 5 on our list. And then from learning progressions, it goes to instructional resources alignment and rubric development and performance assessment tasks. So the full experience kind of happens after that's agreed upon. But you also kind of begged the question for me. We are still going through a process coming up to get feedback on this. So, you know, could it be our first revision to the process? I don't know. Like you guys know, I don't disagree. And Donnie's put up a screenshot from Essential Skills and Dispositions, and that they have actually done this work. So what you see there are the kind of, if you unpack creativity, you have those original elements at the top, and then at 4 junctures from beginner to expert, then they have shown what it looks like as those skills are developed in learners over time. So that beginner doesn't necessarily mean primary. It's whenever you begin, you know, learning something new or begin focusing on something like creativity and curiosity. But a lot of this technical work does exist in research and in practice in other places.
Okay, so if we need a recommendation to move forward or to table, either one of the two. I think we've had thorough discussion at this point in time. So
I would make a motion that given that input and the points that have been made, that we do add this as a 6th item. And then with the additional information that's out there, folks can utilize that, and individual districts can then choose, but it puts it in front of them as an option. If they want to fold it in, they can do that. But I think my motion is to add it as a 6th.
Okay, Michael has made the motion to add it as a 6. Is there a second?
I'll second. Nicola Mason.
Okay, a second by Mason. So we will have a roll call vote. Meredith?
Randy Poe.
I vote yes to be with the group.
Lou Young.
Lou Young, I vote yes, and may I explain my vote?
Yes.
I would just say bravo to this team. We just modeled exactly what we hope communities, schools, and districts grapple with when they're making these decisions at the local level. Have the conversation out in the open, figure out what works and what doesn't work and why. And then, as Mike said, seek the additional resources that we need to make that happen. So one of our main goals as the state board was to model this process for the whole state, and you guys just made that happen. So kudos.
Thank you, Dr. Young. Meredith, back to the roll call.
Nicola Mason.
Nicola Mason, yes.
Audrey Gilbert.
Audrey Gilbert, yes.
Mike Hesketh.
Mike Hesketh, yes.
Penny Christian.
Penny Christian also voting yes to go along with the group, Dr. Poe.
Thank you.
Travis Hamby.
I will echo that sentiment as well. I vote yes. Travis Hamby, I vote yes.
Chair,
Thank
all
you.
members present have voted.
Okay, so the motion passes. Thank you all. And I echo what Dr. Young had said. I think it was a good conversation. I'm one of those ones that it could be either way, but I think it was a great conversation, and you guys convinced me, especially Michael, with the following work, and Lou with the fact that it looks like Donnie has things for that, so it looks like they can all be explained. So as long as we can explain those at those different levels, I think it's great work. And like you say, nobody's against. It's like whether we had 6 or 10, nobody's against either of these. The key question in the end is, how does it impact student learning, and how does it impact the teachers and what they're doing on a daily basis? And can they understand it? And if they can understand it, that's what's great about it. So it's just, we don't want to get it too wheelie. If we go back to me, if we go back to the full board and the full board says, start thinking about this, start thinking about that, we know we're past it at that particular time, and we got to draw a line somewhere in what we need in the classroom. So I think it was a great discussion. So now, Donnie, we're back to you on your discussion of the activity, the review of lessons, the implementation proposal for the portrait of a graduate. Donnie's going, we all know who Donnie is, but for those in the audience, Donnie Train, the partner for Center of Innovation and Education, will facilitate this discussion, which will include the review of lessons learned from the journey mapping conversations that we started on Monday and that we were all tasked to have and complete and send back to Donnie. And Donnie, bless his heart, because I know I sent a lot of things to him late, so he was up all night putting all this together, I'm sure. So, Donnie, it's yours.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Poe. It was really wonderful to read through all of the journey maps that you all have diligently completed in behalf of this project. And I do want to echo Chair Young's sentiment that we are modeling these competencies. Right? We are engaging in productive collaboration and engaged citizenship, and certainly some real signals and signs of creativity as well as we're thinking about the options and ways in which we might implement this. And so kudos to us for doing that in such a way. I do want to just offer up some space. I've read through all of the journey maps that you created, and yes, people were all over the place with regards to how they how they interpreted the assignment, which is cool. Speaking of divergent thinking, but I wanted to actually just go around the horn and give people a chance to summarize one or two key learnings that they made from the experience of talking to people about how an implementation strategy might actually play out in their lives. And this, this is really a space to share what, who you spoke to, and then kind of what insights you gained from them. I won't do a roll call.
We'll start. Lou's up at the top left, so I'll start with Lou, and then
All
we'll
right. Well,
around.
I have these conversations a lot, as you know. So my conversation was with a colleague, just in the interest of time to have this conversation. So we really dove into the idea around implementation at the state level and what that would look like moving forward, and kind of not unlike the conversation, Randy, that you and I had before the meeting started today about what implications the state level profile might have in terms of autonomy at the district level and choice. And so I went back to the ECS brief to look at those. I really like how Utah is thinking about that. So we looked at that together and thought more about what that might look like moving forward. So we stayed at the kind of policy level in the conversation, but admittedly, I was talking to a fellow believer.
That's great. I mean, I think in order for this to work, it's going to have to happen at every level. And so I think it's completely useful to consider what it looks like at the state and from a policy perspective. Great. Who's next?
Nicola? Nicola. Miss Mason.
Thank you, Randy. I interviewed 3 people because I had easy access, and I really wanted diverse perspectives. So a retired superintendent who is currently a professor with us, a senior teacher who's teaching sort of family consumer sciences, so electives, and a current principal. There were some really, great discussions about creativity. All of them, as you can imagine, thought that it was lacking in the past 5 indicators and thought that it was critical to include it. But I focused on the question of developing a teacher profile. And there were some really good suggestions, considering updating EPSB's Code of Ethics to include some kind of version of that, or the importance or the significance or the emphasis of in employability skills or soft skills or teacher profile. Some of the conversation evolved, and they were saying, one of the people I interviewed said that the one person they're the most afraid of at a job fair is the CEO of Toyota, because they're always looking for teachers, because the teacher curriculum is very designed for soft skills. It's supportive of that, and so I think there's a lot of value in that, including the EPPs in rolling out some sort of teacher profile would be really important. And if we go even into more details, is including it in our syllabi as statements, the value of employability skills and soft skills, and nurturing that in pre-service teachers. I think, generally I would say that there wasn't a lot of familiarity with the Portrait of a Learner, not to any great depth that could, I had to provide a lot of sort of explanation, historical, and go through the Portrait of a Learner. But that a lot of schools already are implementing some version of it, so they didn't feel like it would be a big stretch for them to include this. And developing a teacher profile would go hand in hand. So they thought it was a good suggestion.
Okay, thank you. My screen jumped around now, and I've got Michael up at top. So Michael went from the bottom right to the top.
That was a sign. It was my turn.
I know. I don't.
So I focused on the number one in the group that is about the community. And I had the opportunity to meet with our state representative, our county judge executive, and our director of our Chamber of Commerce and our Economic Development Foundation, and get their perspective. All of these folks had attended our earlier in the summer luncheon where we rolled it out that this was something we were looking to bring to the community. So they were all familiar with the Shelby County Profile of a Graduate and the intent of our L3 to take this community wide. Some had been parents of students through Shelby County schools, have a business in Shelby County, and are serving in a government capacity. So they had a range of perspective on it. And the others really added mostly business perspective. They were all very supportive and positive about the idea. They had a lot of concerns about the challenges we face in implementing and perceived barriers that will be there, but it was constructive feedback. So I shared my notes of some of the comments that they made, but it was a very good exchange, and I think that there's work to be done, obviously, as we take this out in the community and everyone embraces it. But I think our community is excited about the potential.
Great, thank you, Audrey. Gilbert, you're muted.
Yeah. Okay. I interviewed a student and I focused on the implementation choice number 4 about giving a voice to your experience in school. And he really liked the idea of including creativity and curiosity with the skills. He even went back and referenced the skills a few times. We sat there and conferred on my computer together. So he went back and referenced those skills a few times, which was really nice to see. But we also talked about what it would mean in his day-to-day schooling. So he's more familiar with the project-based learning method in school. So he really talked a lot about project-based learning and how that would look with the skills and skills at his own school. And kind of he focused on critical thinking, talked about how you can't really judge critical thinking like on a just right there, you are critical thinking or you aren't. You kind of have to hear an explanation of it. So he talked about that and how he believes that project-based learning would really help with that and how that's helped him in his high school experience so far. He also talked about how the more we develop the skills out and more as students we develop skills, the better we are at talking about our experiences and the better we are at articulating them. So that was a difference for him between how he had middle school with no profile of a graduate mentioned and high school, where that's been more of a centered focus. And then he also talked about how profile of a graduate at his school has made him a better community member, but also that's been more of a focus in school on how you can be a better community member with the skills that you're developing. So it was kind of difficult, even with some prompting, to get to a step-by-step level more than just a broad, how does this impact your experience? But overall, he very positively reflected on his experience as a profile of a graduate and where he would like to see it go in the future. He has not done a skill defense yet, so I think he's looking forward to that as much as one could. But yeah, that was it was kind of difficult to talk about the steps because we didn't necessarily have like the vocabulary and the terminology behind more of the classroom day-to-day methodology practices, but the overall reflections of the student were really positive. And he also really wanted to mention, he wanted to make sure I mentioned this to everybody, that he wants technology classes, very much wants technology and career path classes, and has seen how his profile of graduate skills are impacted by that and how that could be one way of implementing those skills is in career paths and things that are more customized to your interests so that you're able to see how those skills work in a setting that you'll be taking into the future.
Great. Travis?
Yeah, so I interviewed a colleague from another school district, and it was a larger district, very much focused on achievement and kids doing well on the state assessment. And so we had a really interesting conversation. Really did not feel that the portrait of a graduate was needed if we were really focused on the standards. That it seemed to be a distractor from the work that needed to be happening in districts. However, took our moment seriously to think about the steps if indeed this were put in place, and really focused in on I was going to do this hybrid where we looked at that alignment. I think it was number 2 or 3, the alignment of those to local resources and things that were happening in the district. And then the other one was the capstones. We ended up kind of focusing in on the capstones and the shifts that would need to happen to really make that happen as it relates back to developing those skills around the portrait of a graduate that we're talking about. And so for sure, talked a lot about the standards and the rigor of the standards, specifically talking about if we were really focused on the standards and we were cognitively engaging students, we really wouldn't need to be talking about these things because students would be developing those skills that they needed. However, played along with me in this and talked about the pedagogical shifts that would need to occur for students to be able to do that. The alignment of those instructional resources, really focused in on the shifts of beliefs that teachers would need to happen and how that was going to be probably the most challenging thing to really focus on is that particular aspect of it. I thought it would be easy to get kids involved in projects and refining projects and doing those things, working up to this moment of a capstone project, but really thought that the difficult part was the change of beliefs, that too often we go to professional development, professional learning, yet we don't implement those things even when we've learned and heard about them. So it really does come back to that whole belief piece for this individual. So for me, the learning was, we have a lot of districts that are doing really well in the space of student learning and achievement. And so I think it's going to be really important to be able to connect the why behind the portrait of a graduate as it relates to these districts and why this is important and necessary work for us to do. So I think that the whole rollout process is going to be really, really important for us to think about what that looks like, and to help make meaning for all of our districts, district leaders, if we really want to have that happen around that shift of mindset that this individual talked about.
Yeah, and very good. And before I get to Penny, I will say, Donnie, Travis just summed up a lot of conversation, I'll say, about where the thing is on the superintendents that I talked to, a similar thing, and then I add something to that, but I won't rehash everything that Travis said. So you can actually put a ditto on almost all he said, and I'll add a few things when I get to my part. But Penny, you go next. So you can just put ditto up there. Penny.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Okay, so I interviewed a district person, and part of her department deals with equity and community engagement, trying to build that relationship component. And one thing that she said, I really need to find it so I don't want to misquote her. She said, she gave a definition for what she thought the curiosity part was, but what she said about creativity was that it places limits. And that goes back to when I mentioned, how it's measured and what does that look like. So she's not a fan of necessarily adding the creativity part. She gets curiosity, and she feels that curiosity should actually be, a common thread through all of them, right? Maybe one of those sub points when we talk about what this looks like as the final document. She's in Fayette County, so of course we are in the county that has a portrait of a graduate. It's very clear. It's very succinct. We actually just last summer, we dug in again and we edited and we added some things and we tweaked it to talk more about the innovation and to make it more balanced. And our mindset has always been, when you look at the portrait of a graduate, it is not just this list of things that you check, you say your junior year, and by your senior year, you have these things. It was a living, breathing document, and she literally said that it was a living, breathing thing to assist all of us in getting our students ready to go out into the world. And the section that I chose was continued mapping of current programming, because when it comes to community in this aspect, we realize that this new one is being driven by business and workforce. So she said, in terms of steps, the first thing would be trying not to replicate, right? She says, because at any given time, you have people coming in and wanting to bring in new programs or mentoring groups or whatever it is. So trying to streamline that and not replicate it so much. Excuse me. And the next step, there was more along the lines of taking which ones are effective and being able to translate it into the portrait of a learner or a portrait of a graduate. So all of her steps were about taking the current programming we have, identifying and acknowledging what works, and then going back to the community and trying to hold true to what they want in terms of their creativity and curiosity. So I thought it was interesting because with her position, she sees both aspects of it, right? And she also had a senior. Her son just graduated, and she really did dive into Fayette County's portrait of a graduate to see if it was balanced and how ready. Her kid's extremely ready. Don't get me wrong. Good Lord, that kid is ready. But he's going to change the world, I promise you. But for her, the community aspect, because a lot of the things he did extracurricular were embedded in the community. So I think looking at that creativity and curiosity, she's not a fan of the creativity, doesn't know that it needs to be a sixth, but she sees the need for the curiosity part being embedded and threaded throughout the rest.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I interviewed several superintendents. I had 2 superintendent focus groups because there was 2 co-op meetings that I attended yesterday. So I met with several. Now, the difference from Travis to mine, I had focused on competency-based education as opposed to the capstone. part of the problem that they see in the competency-based area is, besides what Travis had talked about, is the overall ecosystem and how this portrait of a graduate in competency-based education, how does this work in relationship to the other work that is taking place? There still seems to be a large ecosystem question around L3 work, the districts of innovation, because they're focused a lot on competency-based education, but then, you know, it's clearly defined that the deeper learning is not competency-based education in and of itself. You know, as Dr. Young and I was talking about, that, you know, that has a definition all by itself. But then they list 6 competencies underneath that a school district needs to do if they're really focused on deeper learning. So then the question became in the thing about the ecosystem and of what competencies do we focus on? Or do we focus on the profile of learner competencies that are being developed, or do we focus on the deeper learning conversation or competencies that they have listed? So the question was, why are we doing this then? Because each district, lots of the districts that I spoke to had a profile of a graduate or some similar document that they follow in the district. So the question that I kept getting back was why? Why? What is our why? So when we're out there selling our message, we got to tell what that why is and why that why is there. And the biggest issue or concern about resources and all the other things in trouble with implementation is about assessment. So they clearly want, why are we doing a profile of a learner, and how does that tie into ultimately the assessment system? And we know that Commissioner Glass has said there's going to be, you know, a third iteration of assessment, but they're saying when we roll this out, if we roll out a profile of a graduate and then we don't define the ecosystem around there, and the ecosystem must include assessment, or the question that I got back is that this will be something that's on the wall, because unfortunately, it's still there today because it's going to be released in a couple weeks, I guess, the test scores, that the assessment will drive the curriculum versus the curriculum driving the assessment. That if we have a curriculum, are we assessing Kentucky's curriculum in relationship to this learner of a profile, or are we just doing a federal assessment? So what they would like to see, if we're moving truly in competency-based education and we're doing this learner of a profile, that our assessment system for the federal government, we do the bare minimum so that we can really develop the competencies around this profile of a learner, and let the districts then utilize a flexibility in the assessment system that can clearly define those competencies. Because one of the things that they felt that was lacking in this conversation with the board is there needs to be more business input into what are those assessments that we're really looking for when that profile of a learner is transitioning out. So they talked about, you know, that our assessment should be really focused on 5th, 8th, and 12th grade transition in this profile of a learner, so that when they're transitioning from elementary, this is what that student coming into middle school has, the middle school transitioning to the high school, so that they're not focused on chronological age again, but what are the skills at that classroom or that middle school level versus, oh, in 6th grade, we're going to do this, 7th grade, we're going to do this, in 8th grade, we're going to do this. No, here's the 8th grade competencies leaving, and let them map out where that should take place. So that was the focus of superintendents. The principals that I spoke with in and around competency-based education, just like Audrey, are already there and focused on competency-based education and the rubrics there. But what they said is if we're going to develop these competencies, that the competencies really need to be clearly defined for the teachers, because their experience has been a lot of professional development, as you said, in a teacher profile, what a teacher at their school needs to be able to do. And we need to make sure that we do professional development for teachers. What is competency-based? how do they deliver competency-based, because it is different from their traditional classroom teaching versus their mathematics, how that goes into a skill development of a competency versus just learning math by itself, a particular title. So that was, I thought, interesting. Now, what the principal said, what they need is flexibility in time from the old seat time type of situation, where and the lead report. They feel that the lead report in and of itself, or not the lead report itself, but how they have to do the lead report on what teachers can teach right now is still a hindrance of moving into some areas in competency-based education, because some of those competencies fall outside of the domain of what they currently are able to teach. So they would like flexibility in with the Professional Standards Board in relationship to be able to complete a child's ILP, but right now they might not have certain teachers to be able to teach a certain career pathway or an influence in competency-based education. Now with students, I'll just sum up what Andre said, a ditto to what Andre said. That's how the students looked at it. The students see a portrait of a learner or graph different if they're in competency-based education, because they're already doing those things. They already have to collaborate in groups. They have to do presentations. They have to do communication. They have to think critically. They have to define there's a 5-step process in defining the problem, coming up with solutions, and presenting those and seeking feedback, and then representing that as they continue to develop. So students I think students are, it's just like they're very resilient in what they do, and they jump to it quicker than we do as adults. Okay, so for students, no issue. Principals, time, resources to make that transition. Professional development's going to really have to be solid to get competency-based education across the board. And for superintendents, it's like, this is a local decision. Why are we doing it? So we've got to be very clear and build an ecosystem where this is ultimately is aligned, that it doesn't look like one committee's doing one thing, another committee's doing another thing, and another committee's doing something different. And that's how the superintendents kind of felt, or summing their conversations up, is we need to get a purposeful ecosystem that we can say how this all aligns. Okay, now we have it in our minds, but they don't have it in their minds, okay? Because they're still dealing with getting kids back in school, COVID, all that other stuff. And we clearly got to let them know that we are willing, if we're going to go down this path, that this will drive, this sums up to one superintendent. I'm all for a profile of a learner if this will drive, if this is our vision and it's going to drive the curriculum, which will drive the assessment and not the reverse way.
Dr. Poe.
Yes.
And I was literally about to ask you that question. I'm listening to what you're saying about the superintendents, and it's a multi-layered question, I guess, that I have. What is their biggest concern with this, or what's the apprehension specifically? And is that specifically going back to assessment and testing? And they're trying to relate that to that.
I think because of where we happen to be in the time of the month and the time of the year, that they're purely focused on the assessment results that are going to be coming out and looking at those. And so when you ask for feedback at certain times of the year, you're going to get critical feedback in relationship to their world. And their world right now is the test results coming out, and how is my school going to be affected by these test results? And how is my strategic planning all going to be developed? And then here we are as a state saying, here's the thing. So they're going to me, it directly pulls them back to the end piece, which they said yesterday, if we're doing assessment, the assessment has to be forward facing. Right now, our assessment is not forward facing. It's a summative 3 months later. They've already got their plans for this year. Now they're going to get their test. They got to see if their things matched up with it or not. So they're in that realm of testing. So I think that's what drives that question right now. And I think that, I was fortunate to be in a district that with our board that we developed our community-based accountability model years ago, in that our state testing was just a small piece of our overall accountability system within our district. But that's not necessarily the case across there, especially when you're a district and you're close to that bottom 5%. That assessment is driving everything that they think of on a daily basis, because they're trying to make sure that they don't fall into that 5%. So they know with COVID, just like businesses, the one thing when the test results come out, I hope that individuals realize that businesses suffered in the last 2 years with COVID. A lot of them closed up in different things. Our teachers in our schools made sure kids were in school, and we did the best learning that we possibly could. So yes, we know on the national level the test scores aren't going to be the greatest. But they are still the ones at the end of the day who are held accountable for those test scores. And that's what's on their mind, is the assessment. So when you talk about competency-based education, it's okay, this is great, but how do we assess it? And our current assessment system is, lack of a better word, a paper and pencil, whether you're doing it on a computer or not. It's still a paper, pencil, ACT style arrangement. But we're using those results to say a school is doing well or a school is not doing well. And then yesterday, several of those superintendents, while they were in the assessment mode, because I think Travis was on the committee, they were setting the benchmarks of what the cut scores were for green, yellow, and red. So
yeah, I was in that room, and that's why.
Okay, there you go. So some of those superintendents are some of the ones that I talked to. So of course, assessment was totally on their mind when I was trying to do this exercise and get it done.
That's wow. You guys did. It's not a competency-based thing, but I give you all a gold star for your homework. Thank you. Penny, come on. I took notes as well as I could in part 4 of the workspace document. And what I'd like us to do now is, our goal is by the end of this coming hour to move forward with recommendations about how to implement. That's aligned to both innovations and that have been developed by other states and other people who have blazed this trail before us, and everything that we've learned and processed from the folks that we talked to. One of the things that I said that I would do between the last meeting and this one was to come up with a codification of some promising ideas that were a synthesis of some of the things that had the most energy from our last conversation. And I've done that, and I'm actually in this conversation, as I've been listening to you, been making real-time edits to this to try to pull what you've learned in here. But you can see that under part 5. Would it be helpful if I put it on my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Every time I do that, you guys become tiny, tiny, tiny things. So I don't. It's part of my problem. I can't see all your faces anymore, but here we go. Okay, so what you can see here is a progression of some action items that the department and this group could take on and recommend. And also one thing that just listening to this conversation has made me wonder if this is something we would also want to advance and put forward. The idea of principles of implementation, because some of these things they're not specific to any one initiative. They're just things that however a local community would want to take this on, they just want to keep these things in mind. They're going to be key to doing this successfully in any context. So I don't have any pride of authorship around any of this. So what I'm hoping that we can do now is take everything that we just learned from our journey maps and the discussion that we just had and interrogate the wording and the structuring of these promising ideas. So I'll just talk through them quickly, and then we can just dig into making sure that they feel like the right things for this point. First, there was very clear energy around organizing local and statewide engagement with the Portrait of a Learner. And I think this is reflected in people have to understand our why. here that we kept on bringing up previously. Oops. And then second, support local efforts to define what the state profile looks like and in the local context, and map that to the local context and assets. Third, develop.
I'm sorry, Donnie, could you clarify that a little? What do you mean there? I didn't quite follow what you meant.
Sorry, it's missing a word locally. So I think it's what the state profile looks like when done by a community is going to vary. And so each community, as they get into it, whether they have one already, they're going to need to define with greater clarity and detail what the state profile, like how it plays out in their local context, and what assets and local initiatives are already that are already aligned. This is what I think I was hearing a lot from Travis and Randy, that people have initiatives underway. Both they may have an actual profile, and some of them have CBE, deeper learning, L3 work that's already happening and is underway. And so it has to, whatever it looks like locally has to be in the context of what's already happening. So that's what it's trying to capture there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Third, develop aligned teacher and leadership profiles that describe the different ways of leading that are necessary to advance the student portrait. This is building on, what I heard from Nicola and what Travis had brought up at the last meeting, that actually leading in a way that supports this sort of student work just requires a lot of competencies that are quite different than the ways that people tend to lead now. Fourth, empower and support local communities to explore different ways of implementing the portrait. So this could be through things like competency-based systems, capstone projects, graduation requirements, local accountability changes, and alignment of out-of-school learning. And so this is really like let's allow people to choose a way that makes sense for them. And so then, as we spur that local work, there was, I think, a real energy around networking those communities to learn from one another and harness what insights they're gathering. And I think there's already a vehicle for doing that, which is the United We Learn Council. Could be a space for all of that learning to kind of come in and be used to inform broader policy changes. And Randy, I think what you're bringing up around assessment and accountability is certainly already an emphasis within the United We Learn Council. The principles of implementation, this is building directly off of what Audrey learned, is that we have to cultivate student leadership of the process. That's going to be true of any of the above. So that's why I put it as a principle of implementation rather than like its own strategy. Building on community context and assets, none of the above will work if we don't do that. And then Travis, I think what you learned from your interview around made me think we need to take mindset shifts very seriously. I think this is not just frameworks and new professional learning and skill development. It's like these are actual fundamental mindset shifts in how we think about education. There's something from our first conversation around the curiosity piece is that people get concerned that measurement is going to drive some unintended consequences. But I think that maybe one way to square that is to say that we want to preference calibration over measurement. Like we want to be spurring conversations for people to ask each other, is that creativity? Not, is that a 4 on a rubric for creativity? I think we want to calibrate on whether or not, like to what extent something looks like what we're all collectively going after. Less is more. I think like there's just a lot going on and people have a lot on their plates, and probably doing a little bit less, but doing it well and with focus is better. And that ultimately and this is maybe my own framing of the ecosystem language, that we want to support coherence of initiatives, which I think is about creating a healthy, aligned ecosystem where all the pieces are kind of meshing with one another. But we can go with a more ecosystem-focused language there. Okay, I talked a bit. This is my synthesis of where sort of our conversation is. So please let me know if this feels like aligned to what we've been saying.
Okay, thank you, Donnie. I think you captured the conversation very well, but I will open up to the floor for others to add or ask you questions. Okay, well, nobody's jumping in, Donnie, so it's back to you.
I would offer Dr. Poe first affirmation that I do think Donnie got it right, as he often does in listening and analyzing the feedback that he received along with our conversations. I endorse the idea of those principles. I think that just the ones you captured today really speak to me. I like a lot of the document, Donnie, and I think it's very clarifying. But those principles of implementation, especially as it relates to mindset shifts, and the role of leadership, I just added some thoughts there in terms of what I think is what we learned about that. I think is extremely important. Preferencing calibration is going to be really important. That's a loaded statement that's going to take a lot of unpacking for folks to really understand what we mean about calibrating student development of these skills and competencies over time. And that kind of rocks our state assessment mindset there. So I do think those are really important to capture. I think those will be extremely valuable to us as we move forward with the design phase. I do have one question that I'm wondering, and this is like one of those lawyers, I'm not supposed to ask a question if I don't know the answer to it, but I'm really wondering if, in light of Randy's comments about folks being so stressed about state assessment and accountability, one of the things the commissioner has been really careful to do, and so have I, is to not talk about what assessment might look like. I'm wondering if that is a problem. Should we begin prototyping a bunch of, or some, what ifs, what it might look like, kind of a field of dreams approach idea, or are we still too early in that process? Because I know we're, kind of restraining ourselves from, jumping the gun on this work. And I just wonder if at what point we will know that it's time to actually start saying, here's what it might look like.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lou. I think that feels really right to me. One of the things that, and I think several of you have actually seen it. There is a memo and a presentation that we asked Lions Assessment Consulting to put together that paint two different alternative pictures of what accountability could look like. One is based on essentially a kind of an advanced accreditation model, and another is based on what's called empowerment evaluation, where you're asking all stakeholders to engage in the process of self-evaluation of the system and whether or not it's meeting its outcomes, which these are both provocations and are actually meant to be understood that way. But it is to that express purpose to get people to shape their conceptions of what it could look like to do accountability differently, while still maintaining a focus on the statewide equity responsibilities. Both of those can be done in a way that still keeps an eye on subgroup performance and equity issues. But I think that might be in order in terms of, and it is part of the COOL Council, the United We Learn Council approach at this point.
Yeah.
Travis has his hand up. Travis.
So I guess I wanted just to react to that question as well from the perspective of I do think it's important, but isn't that what we're trying to accomplish with the L3s? And I certainly hate to put something out that then begins to paint a picture instead of, because when you do that, people start looking or pointing toward that, right? The whole reason in the L3 work why we did not bring vendor partners on too early was to keep that thinking wide open about the possibility. So I guess I see the point, I see the reason why we would maybe want to consider that. But I feel like we need to be elevating the work that's happening in the L3s to say, here's some things that are being tested. And maybe we're not bringing that to the forefront enough for people to really understand what's taking place and what's being cultivated in these communities that are happening across the state.
And Travis, that's an excellent point. And that's what I meant before about the ecosystem. I agree with you. I don't think that our committee should be defining what assessment is. That's where another committee, but that's where the ecosystem has to be laid out from KBE or KDE in relationship to how this does roll out. That we do have a learner profile being done by this group, but then KDE people, staff is working with your L3 community to drive or to change this. And that's where they're working on this work. But we then have to have KDE, the individuals that's driving that work in L3, being able to say, these are things that we're testing out in relationship to this. That's why I'm saying that an alignment process from our commissioner or from the board that clearly says this is how this is being laid out, so that we stay in our lane. And you're right, L3s are in their lane and what L3s are doing. But I think right now there's not enough superintendents out there that understand the ones outside of L3 don't know really what L3 is doing. Okay. It's not being clearly communicated across the board what the work of L3 is doing and how that might be driving the assessment changes.
And Dr. Bowe, if I may, just to come back to the last conversation on our call, I think, and amplified for me in the last couple of days in the work that we've been doing at the state, how important it is for the department, as we propose this, our assessment accountability folks have got to be in this conversation, right? The State Department of Education. And for those things, I think, as you talk about superintendents, and I think about DACs, assistant superintendents, those district folks that are engaged in school districts, when they don't see that taking place and that collaboration, it doesn't appear that these things are in sync with one another. And so it sends a message, whether intentional or not, the message is being clearly articulated, right? And so it's important for those things to begin to come together so that we can all be on the same page about what's happening, and including what the work of the L3s, or most importantly, maybe the work of the L3s.
Correct. And I think in Dr. Young and myself were having that conversation, earlier prior to this meeting and yesterday, and we'll continue on that particular conversation. We almost need to do it, and it's not our committee to do, but what what I'm recommending is a journey mapping with Donnie and the KB department and the commissioner to do a journey map of all these things that's there, so that if you are and the people you represent, which is superintendents on this committee, are struggling with some of these concepts, then others are going to struggle with it. So, I know that in Northern Kentucky, for example, our fall convening's coming up. So what we've done is we have Dr. Thompson's going to speak on the post-secondary goals, and it's basically the Kentucky Continuum, type of situation. And then the commissioner is going to talk about how unbridled learning works in that ecosystem to create more degrees. And then we got our GROW people talking about how they're working with U-Science and in ILP work to align to that. And then we're aligning the other things. So we're trying to clearly articulate for the superintendents and for the teachers or whoever, how this all lines up so that it's the continuum is working from preschool all the way to post-secondary. And that's what our profile of a learner graduate work will do. But then what are the other groups that, like you said, are assessing that? So where does L3 fall into this? Where does deeper learning fall into this under the unbridled system that, you know, yesterday went out on a newsletter about, you know, the commissioner developing a council of work on that applications for, you know, his unbridled council. So, you know, what work are they doing? That's how does this work then fit into their work? And I think that's part of the journey mapping that I got. So I just think that that's from our journey mapping to Donnie and for Donnie's recommendation to who he's working with that is something that would be great to tie these different things together so that we know how they all work. Because as you just said, I knew of L3, but I really didn't know what the purpose of the L3 work, Travis, was around assessment. I knew you guys were working on competency-based education, capstone projects, but I didn't know that you were looking at ways for an alternative assessment because, you know, when I've had conversations with Rhonda, for example, I'm not sure Rhonda's had those conversations that L3 is having. So I think you brought out a very good point. Cross collaboration of these groups need to happen for a good ecosystem to really take shape, and because we want this to be successful. The purpose of the journey mapping, or what I got from Donnie's exercise, is how do we make this a great thing for across the state? And what I would also say, Donnie, I think that in what I heard also from my groups that I talked to, that they would look forward to, you know, you or the commissioner or however doing journey mapping still with different groups across the state. That this should be a start, but not necessarily a finish, so that we continue to make this even better than what a committee of 8 people can do right here, recommending to the board.
Just a couple of follow-ups, Dr. Poe, if I may.
Sure. Yeah.
First, for our listening folks, I just wanted to capture what was over in the chat. It's United We Learn, not Unbridled Learning. I'm afraid that might confuse some folks to a couple of commissioners.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. I just wanted to make sure we got that one clear. But and I think as I think about unbridled learning and those elements of the ecosystem that we've talked about now, including this work, Portrait of a Learner, and the L3 work, and PBL works, and support from Knowledge works, and all of the partners that are jumping in to support these efforts. I'm reminded that Ron Heifetz taught us that the kinds of changes, technical changes versus adaptive change, are very different in nature, and we are experiencing both of those as we move forward. And we know how difficult it is as adaptive leaders to cast such an important and big vision that is recognized in United We Learn, and then understanding those big shifts that will happen as that unfolds. So I think the conversation is really important, and I think you're touching on how complex, ambiguous, and messy this kind of adaptive leadership is, and then amplify that at the state level, and it's just darn hard. And I think that's kind of what we've been grappling with here. So your comments were very helpful to me, and we all strive for coherence as we move forward in this, and recognizing coherence, knowing that we are still in evolutionary emergent change, is also a really hard task, but I think that's important. So how do you get clear about something that is emergent is an art, but it's an important challenge, I think.
And to build on that, I'm drawing a thread here and actually making an adaptation to the principle of implementation here. that really coherence has to be built at and between multiple levels. It won't work if coherence only gets between all of these different initiatives.
Right.
Only happens locally, and then there's no coherence building at the state level. And it won't work if all the coherence conversations are happening at KDE and we're not supporting those kinds of conversations locally. And it also won't work unless there's actually crosstalk between those levels for coherence there, across and kind of through both. And so I've made that shift here because I think that will be an important principle to hold. I'm looking at the time, and I just want to make sure that we have enough input and editing of the above ideas. It's, as we discussed last time, it's sort of linear, like it's meant to go really like we've got to do the statewide engagement. We've got to support the local definition of what it looks like and the mapping of local context. We've got to do that sort of aligned leadership and teacher profile work. And then we can spur this divergence and local experimentation, some of which is already happening through the L3 work, deeper learning work, competency-based work. But we can make sure that the portrait is a part of those conversations, and then really bring all of that back together and harness some of the bigger shifts that harness the energy for some of the bigger shifts that have to happen. Any edits to the way that this is framed up?
Anyone? Donnie, you're doing such great work. I think they just want you to fill in those blocks there. Michael, you got any? You've been doing this work for a while, and you guys are down the road. You got any other implementation tips that you would like to share?
I really appreciate the clarity or effort to be clear that you all have shared. I'm really struggling with this concept of crossing over what the L3 is doing, what we're trying to achieve here. I pulled out our problem statement from Shelby County because I was thinking one of the things of the whole profile was equitable learning, equitable education, inclusive education. The reason why as I remember, this was like drinking from a fire hose when I first got in and I struggled. But what I remember was the current assessment and accountability. There was a great video with where they drew things as they described assessment and accountability. Loved that. And I watched it multiple times, but it was explaining that the current system, while good, is not as inclusive and equitable as we would like in terms of the outcome. And so this was an approach to try to address that, to support those on the path to the highest of education, but to also provide an education exposure preparation for life that goes beyond and make it measurable. And it all made perfect sense. It's easy to say all that. Now try to do all that. So we had profile of a graduated in some, and then we were going to do this because there other districts didn't have it, and that made good sense too. So, but I don't know where to go from here. I don't know in terms of our committee. This is all just hard for me. I can give thoughts on things that others say, but I don't know.
Well, and I can echo that. When I first saw the agenda, Donnie, to be honest, I'm not, I think we're trying to do promising implementation ideas, but then the motion, or we're going to have to look at maybe a proposed implementation plan. I'm not sure that that's more of the role to me of KDE than us to actually help you with, of getting there. I think that what you laid out to me, as Michael was saying, that we did the journey mapping. And I think that was a great exercise for us to see what KDE might be staff members might be doing in relationship to trying to roll this out, because I kind of move us back to the policy. We're policy setting, and implementation is actually getting into more procedures and so forth, and not in our lane. But then Lou, you're the chair of the board there. So what are your thoughts on, the implementation plan? I feel like we're kind of crossing over, but you're more of an expert than me on this.
No, not at all, Randy. Not at all. We are both learners in this process. Yeah. And I really appreciate your asking the question, because I realize a lot of times I respond without thinking as singularly as the subcommittee, but I think you make a really valid point in that maybe our work is done. That may freak Donnie out just a little bit, but it doesn't mean, because the United We Learn Council is getting up and running and moving forward, and the board, state board in October may want to say, thank you so much, subcommittee. We have a model portrait of a learner, and we're going to zhuzh it up with graphics and promote that and lean in with folks about what our process was. And maybe moving it to implementation phase is bigger than the ask for this particular committee. So I think that's fair enough. However, having said that, the way that Donnie has laid this out for us to think about what moves next, I'm excited about that, and I want to be a part of it. So if there's another committee, I'm going to volunteer for it. But I think it's fair at this juncture, Donnie, to ask the committee if we think we have met our first charge, and if in fact we want to move forward as a team in this work, or take it to the board in October. I do think I would say one last thing that I would think that our charge is, and that is that we need to push this out for broader feedback now that we are at this, the Jell-O is now jiggling. I think we want to push it out for some more. That might be a task that we haven't quite completed yet, but I'm not sure we signed on for implementation.
No, so I want to thank you for all of that, because it's making
Ms. Mason has her hand up before you totally respond, in case she's got something, Donnie. Hang on for a second. Ms. Mason.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to make the recommendation, if we were completing our work on this committee, that we make a recommendation that a clear crosswalk is created amongst all the different initiatives. And I know I don't want to oversimplify it, because I know it's not that simple, but if we had something black and white that clearly made connections, that would make it much easier for people to understand and implement.
Okay, thanks. Donnie?
Thank you for that. So it made me realize when I heard our collective thinking that maybe I hadn't framed up the task clearly enough, because I do think we're here. So if looking at this screen now, this is what we said we would create. And so I think I just want to know if this feels right. Like what we just talked about as the proposed implementation strategies, this is it. I mean, I think this is what we are recommending that KDE then take as marching orders to try to do. And we can remove the timeline element because we may not know that, right? And then maybe that is also up to the department to decide. But if we want to advance, because the above here is, and we'll remove the highlighting here perhaps, but these are the elements of the portrait. These are proposed strategies, and then these are proposed principles that we've advanced.
Okay, that clarifies it better. I'm not sure that others saw this document here, Donnie, because I only got it sent to me right at the beginning of this meeting, and I'm not sure everybody saw that. So that's why I think that we were not clear on the task that you were asking us to do. I do agree with what you're saying there. I think that's back in what Lou was saying, without repeating it all, that this is what we do propose. We propose it moving forward, and but the timeline and the other things are for others to be able to do, because I don't think we should be directing work of KDE members. That's where I said I think we might be crossing the line when we do the exact thing. Now, I think everything that you proposed there is something that we can obviously vote on in moving forward. Does everybody take a second to look over the proposal for a portrait of a learning implementation, and then ask Donnie any questions on it before we make a vote here? We've got basically 12 minutes still on our time to get that to Donnie. That's our last thing that we have to do before adjournment. So take a few moments and look over it. And then ask, as you're reading, ask Donnie any questions. Feel free to just jump in. Does anybody have any concerns that Donnie has on the proposal?
I think it doesn't quite capture Nicola's last comment and your original notions, Randy, that maybe it's prequel to this slide, but that we are hungry for some ecosystem concept map.
Right.
At
And
this
I think,
point.
Donnie, clarify the things
the
that you Yeah, go ahead. Donnie, the things that you captured on the working notes, that is part of your implementation, that will be included in your process moving forward, in your proposal, correct? The notes that you took today, because this is something that you had created prior to this, but this was what you captured for today to include in your journey of implementation, correct?
Right.
Or not correct?
Well, I think we are voting on what's shown here now, these proposed implementation strategies, but the notes that we've taken can be synthesized as additional resources relative to these.
Well, I think when we make the recommendation that the proposal that Ms. Mason brought up is that, and I brought up, and Michael has that we've all brought up, is that part of that clarification of as a proposal of learner implementation is to craft a document of the working groups around the different things and what they are doing and how this all ties together in that vision of, as get it correct, this United We Learn process, so that we have the United We Learn process and how the portrait is falling under that, how L3s are falling under that, so that we all know that, especially the board members, when they're going to vote on this profile of a graduate, that will help them know the implementation of what you're doing. So we got to add something there before we approve this.
So I just put in here this network these communities to learn from one another and contribute to the efforts of the United We Learn Council as a part of a coherent ecosystem. I don't know if that's too wordy, but the principle of implementation that I think captures some of the coherence mapping and crosswalking is this idea of supporting coherence between and at multiple levels. It's such a dynamic process. I think we just want to encourage it at all of the different spaces where coherence has to be built. But I'm
sorry,
Nicholas.
No, jump in, Ms. Mason.
Could we articulate it like that? I think because that last one, I don't really get the sense that that's what we're saying, because they're not mutually exclusive, right? They're complementary layers that are intertwined, and I'll get Donnie to figure out the wordsmithing of that. Yes.
Okay, does that help you, Ms. Mason?
It does, yes.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have anything else that they would like to add into the learner implementation proposal? Okay. Hearing none, would someone like to make a motion for the subcommittee to entertain a motion to approve the proposed implementation plan and share this recommendation with the Kentucky Board of Education Curriculum Committee during the upcoming regular meeting? I need a recommendation.
I will make a recommendation that we move forward with this forward.
Thank you, Ms. Mason. Do we have a second?
This is Travis Hamby, I second.
Awesome. Meredith, would you like to take a roll call?
Randy Poe.
I vote yes.
Lou
And
Young.
I will explain like Lou did before. I love the process today. It's been a great meeting. So go ahead. Sorry. Lou.
Lou Young, enthusiastically vote yes.
Nicola Mason.
Nicola Mason, yes.
Audrey Gilbert.
Audrey Gilbert, yes.
Mike Hesketh.
Mike Hesketh, yes.
Penny Christian.
Penny Christian, yes.
Travis Hamby.
Travis Hamby, I vote yes.
Chair, all members present have voted.
Great. Awesome. Well, thank you all. And thank you, Donnie, for your hard work. And like I said, the last 3 days, I know you've really been crunching it. So thank you. And being able to wordsmith on the fly like that and do a great job is very impressive. So thank you for that particular work. At this particular time, I think it's been a very productive meeting. Like I said, I love the process today. I think it's been a great working committee over the last few months and the last few days. So thank you all. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay, thank you, Lou. A second?
Second, Nicola Mason.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mason. All roll call vote. I'm all used to saying in favor. Sorry, roll call vote, Meredith.
Randy Poe.
I vote yes.
Lou Young.
Lou Young, yes.
Nicola Mason.
Nicola Mason, yes.
Audrey Gilbert.
Audrey Gilbert, yes.
Mike Hesketh.
Mike Hesketh, yes.
Penny Christian.
Penny Christian, yes.
Travis Hamby.
Travis Hamby, I vote yes.
I want to thank you all for a great meeting. And Meredith, thank you for keeping us on time and straight and reminding me that we have 3 minutes left before we were turned off. So thank you very much. And thank all the staff members that were part of this and contributing. And Donnie, exceptional work as usual. Great quality work you always do. So thank you very much. And that actually concludes our subcommittee unless the full committee sends work back to us. So Donnie, we're looking forward to seeing you at the full meeting and carrying this work, further on. So thank you very much for your patience with us and getting us to this point. You did a great job leading us.
No, it's an amazing team to work with and for. So congratulations to all of you.
Okay.
Great team. Thank
you
you.
all. Okay. Appreciate it. Meredith, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair Poe. Have a great day.
You too.